Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Kerry Cranston. I'm the president of the American Writers Museum. I want to welcome you to this online program. We're glad everybody is able to be here with us tonight, and we'll give everyone kind of a moment to file into the room, as we say, and find your seats. It usually takes a while when we have a large group for everybody's connection to come live online. So in the meantime, as I said, I'm Kerry Cranston, the president of the American Writers Museum. And as you can see, I'm in the museum right now while we are closed. Right this second, we have reopened with new social distancing guidelines for visitors and new hours on Wednesday through Sunday. So if you're interested in coming by, please visit our website for more information. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we begin. As you're watching this conversation tonight, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We are monitoring that for questions, and at the end of the opening interview, we may contact you via chat to ask you if you would like to ask your question live. If you like the kinds of online programs you've been seeing from us in the past several months, you can become a member and get advance notice of special programs and offers, including book clubs, literary trivia, special behind-the-scenes virtual tours, and lots of other good things to keep you busy during this somewhat weird time. Our YouTube channel has videos posted of programs from the past 3 years. You can check that out as well for news and updates. Our book selling partner, both when we're open here online or here online, is Seminary Co-op Bookstore, and you can order online from them or from our bookshop.org page as well. We're grateful to all of you for being here and valuing the past, present, and future of American writing. Memoir is a genre, is one of the first forms of American literature. Our personal stories and experiences have shaped the narrative of this country as surely as the words of any official documents. We're here tonight to talk with Natasha Trethewey about her book, Memorial Drive, which in the New York Times called a controlled burn of chaos and intellection, and compared to Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song. Natasha Trethewey is a former U.S. Poet Laureate and the author of 5 collections of poetry, as well as a book of creative nonfiction. She has held appointments at Duke University, Emory University, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Yale. She is currently the Board of Trustees Professor of English at Northwestern University. In 2007, she won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for her collection, Native Guard. She's being interviewed tonight by Booklist adult books editor Donna Seaman, who along with Natasha and others led the development of the American Writers Museum. Donna is also the author of Identity Unknown, Rediscovering 7 American Women Artists. If everyone was here in person, I would say, please help me in welcoming our wonderful guests. But for now, I will just say welcome to you both, and thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much, Kerry.
Thank you both for being here. And
Hi, Natasha.
Hey, thank you.
All right. So, Kerry, I really appreciate the welcome. I miss the American Writers Museum. I will try and come as soon as I can. I'm thrilled to be here with Natasha Trethewey, and I want to start by saying congratulations, Natasha.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
So, as you may be aware, I've read a great deal of your poetry. So I knew a little bit about your mother's story, just a little bit. And still, when I read Memorial Drive, a daughter's memoir, it hit me like a powerful wave. I mean, it just knocked me over. And so I would like to tell our audience that this is a book to read twice, because there is a lot to take in. And when I read it the second time, I realized even more deeply how beautifully artistic it is, how carefully structured, how meticulously written, so profoundly distilled. So I thought, Natasha, that we would begin with you reading the opening section, which will give everyone a sense of the voice of this book.
3 weeks after my mother is dead, I dream of her. We walk a rutted path, an oval track around which we are making our slow revolution. Side by side, so close our shoulders nearly touch, neither of us speaking, both of us in our traces. Though I know she is dead, I have a sense of contentment, as if she's only gone someplace else to which I've journeyed to meet her. The world around us is dim, a backdrop of shadows out of which now a man comes. Even in the dream, I know what he has done, and yet I smile, lifting my hand and speaking a greeting as he passes. It's then that my mother turns to me, then that I see it, a hole the size of a quarter in the center of her forehead. From it comes a light so bright, so piercing, that I suffer the kind of momentary blindness brought on by staring at the sun, her face nothing but light ringed in darkness when she speaks. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? I know I am not meant to answer, and so we walk on as before, rounding the path until we meet him again. This time, he's come to finish what he started. Holding a gun, he is aiming at her head. This time, I think I can save her. Is it enough to throw myself in the bullet's path, shout, no? I wake to that single word, my own voice wrenching me from sleep. But it's my mother's voice that remains, her last question to me. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? A refrain.
Thank you. So that encapsulates the tragedy that you recount in this book, namely well, you talk about your childhood and your father and your mother in the early days, and after their divorce, how you and your mother moved to Atlanta, and your mother, Gwendolyn Ann Tobo, is hoping for a great new life with the two of you, and she meets a man and they marry, and he turns out to be an abuser and ultimately her murderer. So that's the tell. And I want to ask you about, to start out just sort of formally, about the writing, because clearly this is very painful. Mm-hmm. This happened when you were 19, so it's been some years. Those of us that have suffered family losses know that doesn't seem like a long time, that it takes that long to process things. Right. So I'm wondering how poetry helped, if poetry helped you structure this memoir.
Absolutely. I worked on it for 7 years, and during the time that I was writing it, a few years ago, I was also working on my book Monument, which was new and selected poems. And I think if I hadn't been working on that book of poems and trying to give order and shape to a new and selected such that it became a different thing than just the sum of its parts, I might not have understood exactly the structure of this memoir as well. That book begins with one of the new poems, Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath, about contending all these years with the kinds of things that people say, insensitive things about domestic violence. And it ends with a poem called Articulation that references the dream that I just read about in the beginning of the memoir. And so structurally, working on that helped me write this book, but also the way I put together collections of poems, thinking about a sequence and ordering. I think about Robert Frost's the apocryphal story about Robert Frost in the 25th poem, which becomes the entire book of poems, each poem in it making up an entire whole that tells a larger narrative with that entire arc. I thought of that as I was working on Memorial Drive.
It's very interesting because there's so much to tell. I mean, writing is always about omission. You have to leave things out.
Right.
And poetry is really the essence of that kind of concentration. But memoirs need to be too, because there's too much information. You have to focus it. You have to focus it and narrow it. And I was really struck by the struggle you had with the years during this second marriage of your mother's, that you had, after her death, kind of closed down that part of your life. It was from 1973 to 1985, I believe. And so the work of excavation, of going back for you, was very difficult. I wonder if you talk about that a little bit.
It was the hardest thing I had to do, because I realized that one of the reasons this took so long is that even as I had set myself the task of writing it, I didn't want to go to the places that I had to go to try to remember. On the one hand, there was all of the willed amnesia that I had enacted all of these years to try to survive. And then there was the kind of forgetting that is what the mind does, I think, to protect us from things that are too difficult. What I found in the attempt to bury so much is that I erased so much. And so to try to recall her meant that I also had to recall all the things that I didn't want to. I read a wonderful book. It's Vivian Gornick's The Situation and the Story. And that helped me a lot because, as you say, there's so much that is left out. And figuring out what the story you have to tell is also one of the hardest things. I could say, this is the situation I was in, a difficult childhood, a tragic loss when I was 19. That was the situation, but it took a very long time to figure out what story I had to tell. It wasn't simply that she was murdered. It was something else entirely. And it's made up of both what I remember and also the silences, the restraint that allows certain parts to shine through and others to recede into the background. I didn't want that violent. Really... I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I didn't want it to be an accounting of the horrible violence that I think my mother must have encountered even more than I know. So that's the part that kind of recedes into the background. And I think perhaps it's the horror of it is heightened even because it's off screen. We don't always see it.
Well, and that enables us to see your mother as whole, as much as you can portray her as a woman. And also, I want to say, that in the early parts of the book where you describe your amazing childhood in Mississippi, surrounded by your extended family, your mother's mother, your great aunt Sugar, you're in sort of this cluster of homes in Mississippi, and you're happy. Your father's there. You have such an interesting family. He was such an outsider. He was a white guy from Nova Scotia. He and your mother met in college in Kentucky. They shared a love of literature and theater. He became a poet and a professor. So those stories, the early year, I found so moving. And as in, the best of writers' memoirs, we get intimations of how and why you became a writer. I love the little detail you throw out that your mother told her mother to write your birth not with bronze baby shoes, as people used to do, but she wanted a set of encyclopedias for you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I've written about, in my first book, Domestic Work, I wrote about those encyclopedias because I started doing research in those encyclopedias back then. I think all of that has very much to do. I mean, I am a poet because of the deep existential wound of losing my mother. But the kind of poet I am has everything to do with that early childhood. The way that I came to language and metaphor and image and research, all of that is from, and even musicality, and all of that comes from there.
Yeah, you tell some amazing stories about the kind of stories your father would tell you, that he kind of steeped you in mythology and cautionary tales, and that metaphor became part of your consciousness really early. I think that's so interesting.
Right, and I've continued to write about the myths that sort of grounded our lives, those stories that he told me. And also, I think the parts of the trauma of my childhood, even the simple earliest trauma of the divorce of my parents, the move to Atlanta. Early on, I was already trying to, I think, deal with those emotions, to deal with chaos. I was very concerned about precision and symmetry and order. And again, that's something that I think characterizes what I try to do as a poet, and to balance that order with silence, with restraint.
Yes, that's so true of your work and so powerful. And you mentioned your first book, Domestic Work. It and your second work, Belloq's Ophelia, were based on photographs to an extent. They were catalysts for you. And photographs play a tremendous role in Memorial Drive, too. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think writing ekphrastically for me really comes out of trying to make photographs in my head, to try to create images that I could hold on to. I talk about this in Memorial Drive, that I began to sort of make pictures of every room in my grandmother's house because I wanted to be able to call it up, to see it, to describe it to people who would listen, because I wanted to hold on to it after we left and moved to Atlanta. I think that's why I've been so drawn to image and thus to photograph. But photographs have always meant something else to me too, a way to read both what is cropped from them. They always, give us only a portion of reality. There's something always outside of the frame. And there's also what happened just before and just after. They are so deeply elegiac to me because in that moment of the photograph, the people can't possibly know what's ahead of them. And yet looking back at it, we do. And I think that's why I turn to them again and again to read what I can see in the faces that they can't have known, and then to also look for indications, Cassandra-like, of what was to come.
Yes, beautifully put. And I laughed when you said Cassandra, because that was the name your father used for you, and kind of in his stories, and would just call you Cassandra. And that became another legacy that was a little hard to deal with.
Indeed. The idea that I could be prophetic, that I could know things that were going to happen and not be listened to. It felt like a burden that he gave to me. And I would think about it in a kind of magical thinking way, that if I imagine things, they might happen. For children, if you imagine something and it happens, it's quite possible that you begin to think that you caused it. And so intellectually, I know that that's not true. And yet I remember in the weeks leading up to my mother's death, telling a friend who didn't know anything about my history, my mother's story, that he could come for her, that he could kill her at any time. And I've never gotten over that feeling that I said it aloud, and then it happened. And I think that has to do with internalizing that idea, again, even as intellectually I know it's not true, of being a kind of Cassandra.
That's a tremendous burden that you write about. You also, your parents both really encouraged you to write. Your father right away, and your mother consistently, in spite of difficult circumstances for her. There was a point where, sorry, to cry too. There's a point where you kind of try to talk to your mother about what's going on in Atlanta, where things are getting bad. And your mother gives you a diary, which is an incredible moment. In a happier life, it would be, a very positive moment and a recognition that you have thoughts to write down, even if they're just for yourself. But in your situation, and this happens to other people too, your private diary with its little lock, was broken into by your stepfather. And instead of retreating, and here's, a testament to your artistry and your great courage and strength, you realized that if he was going to read this diary, that you could address him.
Right.
And you empowered yourself at that moment.
Yeah, in that moment, I just thought, you're right, that somehow I can say whatever I want. And instead of it being a private space that's locked shut only for me to see, I have now an audience. It is meant to be read, and I'm going to write like it's meant to be read. And instead of making me censor myself, it made me say everything that I'd needed to say to him all those years that I couldn't. I even, tried out language I wasn't allowed to say in the house to name him to himself in it. And he never said anything about it. And I knew that he wouldn't somehow, that I knew he wouldn't admit it. And so I could go on like that, having this conversation with him that was not spoken, but clearly articulated.
That's such a profound recognition on your part that he had trapped himself. Mm-hmm. He couldn't say anything because he's not supposed to be doing this.
Right.
What a terrible violation he committed. But that also, he probably couldn't help but read it. And so that was a secret battle going on, and incredible resiliency for you. And it seems to have, that discipline too. You talk about the silence. Mm-hmm. You tried to talk about things and people didn't listen. This is young people's experience over and over again. It's women's experience over and over again. Mm-hmm. Your teacher doesn't help, a woman you very much admired. So you realize that you're going to have to deal with this in whatever forum you can create for yourself.
Right.
And it's very powerful.
Thank you.
Before we go too much further, I want to back up a little. The title of your book is Memorial Drive. I wonder if you could describe that landscape for us, because it's a very particular view of the South, and it's become sort of newly urgent to talk about. So I wonder if you would give us that larger context. I want to say that in all your work, you are you're incredibly generous in your personal revelations. They're always in a historical context. And this goes back to your early drill in the encyclopedias. And you're always curious about the history, about fact, about other sources. So, this doesn't happen in a void. And there's a context that you're very aware of. And because you use it, it's such a perfect title in so many ways, but it's also a really significant place for us all to think about.
Right. So Memorial Drive is the road that leads from downtown Atlanta to the base of Stone Mountain. And Stone Mountain is the mountain upon which the nation's largest monument to the Confederacy is carved. It's sort of a southern Mount Rushmore with Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis right up there. Huge, riding on horseback, sort of looming over everything, because it's a made out of stone, and so it's there's a few trees on it, but it's really bald, and the way that it rises there and looms over everything. It was started early in the 20th century. And strangely enough, even after the Civil Rights Movement, they didn't complete it until 1972, which is the year that my mother and I moved to Atlanta. And this thing that had been going on since, birth of a nation, they didn't complete until 1972, even after all the advancements in the Civil Rights Movement. They still needed to construct this monument to send a message to Black people about their second-class citizenship, which is, of course, part of the conversation that we're having right now. But it also, for me, suggests the metaphor that I was meant to make sense of. Going back to, my father wanting me to have a proper education and proper figurative values, as in Robert Frost's notion of a proper poetical education in the metaphor. because without it, you're not safe in science, you're not safe in history. And this was the history that I would not have been safe in had I not been able to understand the relationship of that monument to the individual death of my mother at its base. There it is telling me that this is what is important. This is what is remembered here. And this small thing is not. And so I wanted to write something that could stand up as big as that monument.
And you have, Julie. Very powerful. And it also makes us think very carefully about what happened to your mother in the larger context. Your first two books we started talking about, which are revisited in Monuments, your magnificent new and selected collection, which I hope all our audience is reading or will read, focuses on the lives of Black women in America and how taken for granted, how overlooked, how, as you were saying earlier, second-class citizens they were treated. And, this falls into the whole procedure that happens with your mother and her attempts to protect herself, to work within the system. Your mother was brilliantly articulate. She was a social worker, well-educated, a professional, did all the right things. And the system failed her ultimately. And there's so many powerful facets of this book. And not only do we have your language, burned down to its powerful essence, but and I ask you to tell the story of how you acquired these, but we also have documents in here, including one in your mother's voice, something she wrote, and also phone transcripts. This is one of those amazing events, I think, that happens when you're on the right path. So if you could please tell us a story about how these came into your possession, these documents.
Yeah, it was pure serendipity. I had moved back to Atlanta to take a job there, and my husband and I were walking downtown Decatur. And mind you, I guess I have to admit that somehow, even though I said I'd never go back to Atlanta, I went back to Atlanta. Even though I wanted to avoid as much as I could about my past, I bought a house very close to the courthouse where the trials were held, and not far from the place she died. And so by being in that proximity, it was as if I was preparing myself for the possibility. Louis Pasteur said that chance favors the prepared mind. And so on this day, we're walking and we encounter a man who comes up to us in a restaurant who recognizes me. I don't know him, but he recognizes me. And it turns out he was, at that point, an assistant district attorney, but had been the first police officer on the scene the morning my mother was killed. And he told me, it had been 20 years then since her death, and he told me that the records are purged after 20 years and that they were getting ready to be purged. And he got them for me and handed over everything from, the various statements, from the first time he tried to kill her, witness statements, her autopsy, transcripts of the phone conversations that she had with him 2 days leading up to her death, where she was trying to get evidence so that they would issue an arrest warrant for him. And I think most importantly, the contents of her briefcase they found that morning, in which she'd left a yellow legal pad on which she was writing her own story about this. It seemed like perhaps a speech she was writing to support the work of domestic violence shelter, because it began talking about admiring the work that they'd done. When you read it, you get the sense that she thought she'd escaped.
It's very powerful, and to hear her voice makes the story all the more resonant, adds a whole other dimension.
Mm-hmm.
To it.
yeah, it was a hard decision to include those things, but it also, I think, was really the only choice I could make. I mean, I could tell you, how brilliant and resilient and calm and smart and patient, all those things that she was. But I think you needed to see it in her own words, to hear her voice come through.
To hear her voice when she was in control of the narrative, and then to hear her trying to control her ex-husband in those transcripts, which are incredible studies in mental illness and an attempt to survive. I've really not read anything like that before.
I mean, she has to do this balancing act of, she has to get evidence. She has to get evidence for the police, for the judge, that he is making terroristic threats so that they will do something to save her. But she also is firm in her resolve that she is not going back to him. She's not going to say things like that to appease him in any way. She is standing her ground and saying, no, but you should get help for yourself. Like it's even an act of kindness.
Oh, definitely. Yes, all the traits you were naming. I mean, her patience is there, her love, her honesty. They're absolutely astonishing to read. And I think bringing them in there, it opens up. I mean, we consistently realize things about the intimacy of violence and suffering and the social setting for it.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's hard to feel sympathy for him, but part of his story involves racism, of course, and the Vietnam War, and that whole setting in Atlanta where you have the Confederacy looming over you all the time. So it tells us a lot. There's a lot of information in those conversations.
I mean, the thing I think about, I'm interested in restorative justice, and I think for him, it means, well, I wanted also readers to see him for exactly how he was presenting himself. But restorative justice, I think, is about remembering, as you say, that there were all these other forces at work that were perhaps crushing his soul, disfiguring it. I had to remember, as I wrote about him, that he was a child once.
Yeah.
Or whatever happened to so disfigure him that he would do this. That just restores to him, I think, his full humanity, flawed as it is.
It's a very different world that your book is entering than what we would have imagined 6 months ago.
Right.
And I think it will be read with even more receptivity and deep thoughts about memory, about memorializing, about the South and what we do with monuments to treason and racism and white supremacy.
Treason, absolutely.
So I'm sure you've been thinking about these things a lot and thinking about the world your book is entering now. Any thoughts you want to share about that?
Well, it is both a time of so much loss and so much grief, a time for a real need to remember and memorialize the lives that we are constantly losing. It is also, I think, a time to be conscious about what might be going on that we don't see. Just as there were things in my household that people couldn't see, I think we're in a moment where there are perhaps so many people who, because of the need to shelter in place, are living with their abusers and not able to get the kind of help that they might need, the kind of help that my mother tried to get. I think we're also having a real reckoning over what we remember and what stories we tell ourselves about a nation, as a nation. I think we'll be contending with how we remember this moment for a long time. And we're being taught, I think, how to look at it by looking at all of those Confederate monuments. To be aware now, for so many people who weren't aware of the messages that they've been sending for, over a century now. And what it means, I keep saying this, you mentioned treason. I mean, we had nearly 200,000 African-American soldiers fight in the Civil War for the Union, fight to preserve the Union, fight for their own freedom. They fought to move this country closer to its own founding ideals. They won the war, and yet there's only a handful of monuments in the North and South to them. Imagine if instead of all those Confederate monuments all over the South, there were monuments to the actual winners of that war, the nearly 200,000 African-American soldiers who fought in it. We would understand ourselves very differently as a nation. And you wouldn't have people who had no idea that Blacks fought in the Civil War. I've encountered so many people who have no idea that Blacks have fought for their own freedom in this country.
Right. That was your collection, Native Guard, where you tell a story of a battalion of that. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking too of a passage in Memorial Drive that both made me laugh and also feel pain. You describe your enthrallment really to Ulysses S. Grant and to Abraham Lincoln. You memorized the Gettysburg Address.
Yes.
And there's a scene you recount where you go into a Civil War cemetery and you sort of speak to some of these headstones.
Yes, I start, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Take that, you Confederate soldiers.
Yeah.
That was such a profound revelation. I mean, you were like 12 or something? I don't know.
Yeah, it sounds like I was a weird little kid, maybe.
I think just very smart and recognizing there the power of words. I mean, that speech, that call for justice and memorializing and accounting.
I mean, it's so beautiful. I mean, it was so beautiful for its sentiment, for what it was saying, but also how it's written. Yeah. And then when you realize, as short as it is, that was just so out of character for the day when people would get up there and talk for, over an hour in a speech. And this is a short little thing that could memorialize those lives lost at Gettysburg. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of a poem.
Yeah.
Well, those moments in this book are just endlessly powerful and fascinating and resonant, and that the way you grow through this as a writer and a person is very moving and enriches your mother's portrait deeply. Yeah. I guess I just wanted to. We're going to throw this open to questions, so I want to say to our audience. Don't forget to post your questions. I will get help from the behind the scenes American Writers Museum people so that you can ask them yourself. I guess I just wanted to mention and kind of go back a little bit to the man that got you the documents and just say that I was very struck by how haunted he seemed. And just to sort of talk about how difficult it is for everyone on the front lines. I mean, we see this now with essential workers and with healthcare workers, and what it really means to face tragedy and death as part of your job. And we see so many horrible policemen and so much brutality and racism and violence. And I was struck by this man that seemed to have really been marked by your mother's death. And
it broke his heart. And his wife said to me as he hung his head and wept, that a day didn't go by that he didn't think about my mother. So yeah, just imagine all of these frontline workers right now who are tending to patients, losing patients, learning who they are, and then seeing them die. It will haunt so many of us for the rest of our lives, this moment.
It definitely will. And yet, and in conjunction with that, we see this amazing flowering of recognition of all that we've been talking about today. You know, recognition of Black Lives Matter, of the lies we've been told and how we have to stop accepting or ignoring them. You know, that idea that it's,
we're bending toward justice. I absolutely think so.
I think so too. And I do think that all of your work will help us, will articulate us and light a path for us. And thank you for that.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to attempt to find questions from the audience. Thank you so much for speaking with me, Natasha. It was such a pleasure. Thank you. Now let's see what we have from our views. Oh, okay. So I see Sonia has a question, and perhaps she will be able to ask it herself.
Hi, Ms. Trethewey.
Hello there.
I wanted to know if you consider your memoir to be a tool for restorative justice and or social justice. If so, how?
Oh, I absolutely think so. I mean, I think, you know, one of the biggest aspects of my mother's story is what it can teach us about how we can combat domestic violence in this country. My mother was understood in the among the people who do work to help women or other people who are suffering in domestic violence. She was called a perfect victim because she did everything right. She used every resource, every outlet that someone is told to try to get themselves out of a difficult situation. And beyond that, she was well educated. She was a social worker. She had friends. She earned a good living and was not dependent upon her abuser for support or to take care of her children. And what is most difficult to me about that story, about her, is that if a woman like my mother, doing all the right things, can't get away, how can we tell women who are less educated, less connected, who don't have the same kinds of resources, who may be poor or dependent upon their abusers for survival, how can we tell them that they can actually get away? Especially given the fact that your chances go up for dying, being killed, because you left. Leaving is more dangerous in many cases than staying. What can we do as a nation to make that not the case anymore?
Thank you. Thank you, Sonia. You have a question from David.
Hello?
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 You can't hear?
Yes, I can.
Yes,
Oh, you
we can hear.
Okay. I know, because I don't sound like a David. It's my husband's name on the account.
Yes, thank you.
But it's Julie Jacobson. Hi, Natasha.
Oh, hi, Julie.
So I wolfed down your book today in one sitting, and it is heartbreaking and so beautiful and such an amazing memorial to your mother. I'm sure she would be extremely proud of you for it. And I can see from watching you on this video how hard it is for you to talk about it and think about it. And I wish I could give you a big hug. I will when COVID's over. But thank you for sharing with us. So my question was actually, I was gonna ask you about Stone Mountain, and when you wrote the book, our country wasn't looking so much at its terrible legacy of Confederate monuments, but so much has changed, and it's possible, I don't know, it doesn't sound like something that can be torn down, but maybe it's something that they can just dynamite and blow up. But you've really kind of talked about that already. So I just wanted to say I also was so heartbroken by that little girl who blamed herself for saying hi to Big Joe from the football stands. And I'm sure you have figured out now it was not your fault at all. And that, in fact, you saved her. You saved her the first time. And you were, from the book, I can tell, the most amazing, loving daughter. And it's just a beautiful book. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. You know, I should say to all of you who joined us that, you know, because writing this was so hard, I find that, you know, the grief feels fresh all the time. It's a wound that doesn't heal. I can give it a kind of palliative care, though. That's how I think about it. You know, and palliative care means you keep the wound clean. Sometimes you find ways to ease a little bit of the pain of it so that you can go on living with it because it doesn't heal. Knowing that you're out there, that I'm getting to have a conversation with so many of you about my mother, that eases the pain a little bit. And even though I look like this, I'm very happy right now. So thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. That makes perfect sense. If I'm doing this correctly, we have what looks like a very interesting question about memory and memoir from Kristen.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you both for this conversation. I really appreciate the thought and care and your vulnerability in talking about these things. As I was sitting here listening to your conversation, and particularly, Donna, about your earlier question about how the form of poetry, how you see that translate to this, I was thinking about how memory and memoir share a cognate, and how you talk a lot about memory, or memory plays a significant role in Native Guard and Thrall and Beyond Katrina. I haven't picked up Monument, my apologies. But I was wondering how the form of memoir, or the genre of memoir as you do it, with including documents and things like that, how that allows you to do kinds of work that perhaps poetry wouldn't allow you to do.
Oh, it's a good question. Well, you know, on the one hand, I really did feel like I was constructing this memoir in much the same way that I make poems or a sequence of poems. Always I am sort of circling a particular question or set of questions. And each piece is meant to try to answer that particular question in a collection of poems. And I wrote this memoir in the same way, also moving in a non-linear way, and looping backwards over things, which is, of course, one of the ways that memory works for us, not linearly, but always a loop back to something else that then helps you see a later moment in a different kind of way. I do feel that this gave me a larger space for meditation to move around in, even as there are probably just as many moments of restraint and silence in this prose as in poetry. But all I can say is that, because I don't know if I fully know the answer, but there would be moments that I would be writing this prose and I'd have to stop and turn the page over and write a poem that came out of it. Also about the same material that I was working in, which is where the poem, which is the first poem in Monument, comes from, Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath, in which I try to answer all of the insensitive things people have said over the years about victims of domestic violence. I could not put that in the prose. It somehow came out as a poem and needed to be. And yet, and there are many things in the prose that I have written about in poems, but it gives me a different lens to look at it through prose. Thanks for the question. I wish I understood even more why I needed one rather than the other in some moments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Scott, you have a question?
Thank you so much for being here at the Writers Museum. I actually just bought your book. So
Thank you.
my question is, what tools or writing exercises do you recommend for excavating the story in one's memoir? And do you try and write the story from different points of view first, or do you have specific questions you ask yourself in regards to why this story, why now, what questions am I hoping to answer?
Mm-hmm. Yes, earlier I mentioned Vivian Gornick's The Situation and the Story. That was really useful for me. After I read that, I actually wrote on a sheet of paper in 2 columns, what was the situation that I was in, and what is the story? And I had a set of questions I wanted to ask myself that helped guide everything I wrote. But another book that was so important to me is Gregory Orr's Poetry as Survival. And even though it is a book about the role of lyric poetry, it somehow also helped me to understand my own grief in some ways. And it helped me even to sort of create in my mind a form for telling this story in prose. It's not necessarily an exercise, but I would just go and read that book and his wonderful memoir, The Blessing, because he has also lived for a long time since childhood with an overwhelming trauma, a wound. And the way that he, I probably have underlined almost every single line in the whole book, and everything in the whole book told me how to write this book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Next we have Kay.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Hello. Is this
Well,
Kay?
First of all, I'm very sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
Yeah. I definitely want to read your memoir. Memoirs are my favorite book genre. But my question to you, I am not a poetry reader. I try and I struggle. And so I guess I would like, do you have any advice on how I should approach reading poetry that could make me appreciate it more?
I think it probably starts with finding the right poets for you. I mean, I really believe that there is a poem out there for everyone, and maybe you haven't found yet the poems that speak to you at this moment. But I think, this is going to sound crazy in a way, but I'll just tell you, my mother-in-law said to me something very similar to what you just said, Kay, about poetry. And so I gave her an assignment that I used to give my students who had that same problem. I would do something sneaky, and I would take a poem and type it up as a prose paragraph instead of the lineated thing that it is on a page. And it's amazing how differently people read when they think they're reading sentences rather than only reading lines. And so if you can learn to read the sentences in a poem, as well as then secondarily, or to go back and then read it with the lines and see the way that they play against each other, I think you'll find that you're clearly someone who can read and infer and know exactly what a sentence means. Read it like that first, but then really search for those poets that might be the ones that are speaking to you right now.
Well, that sounds like really good advice, because that's something concrete that I can try. I can try to put it into prose. So thank you.
Okay, sure.
Good trick. I have to remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I do it with, I shouldn't say this because I may have students who would watch, but I do it with Jory Graham's poem, I Watched a Snake.
Oh.
Such a good one to do it with. And then I get them to try to lineate it themselves before I show them how she lineated it. It's fun.
That's good. I like that. That's good. I've also found if you're having trouble with a certain writer, that if I start typing their prose and try and get in it that way, sometimes it just opens it up in interesting ways. You can learn a lot sort of doing that. Was a trick I know Joan Didion
people telling you to write it out yourself so that you feel the motion of making the words with your hands as well.
Yes, right. That too. I know Joan Didion did that when she was first starting out. She would write other people's work, get in their rhythm. But I digress. Looks like we have a question from Jeff.
Okay. First of all, by the way, I also memorized the Gettysburg Address and did read it at Gettysburg. I know about black soldiers from the 54th to Fort Pillow to the crater, etc. What you're talking about reminded me of Faulkner when he says that the past is not past, or the past is not dead, it's not even past. Mm-hmm. It sounds like that to me, and which, to piggyback on that, I read an interview you gave in Poets and Writers about in the Korean saying about you never really leave the dead behind, you carry them around. I wonder, do you still feel that way? Is the past really still past? Is it past?
No, it's not even past. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past. No, we do carry it with us. We carry every bit of it with us. And indeed, I carry both my mother planted like a seed in my heart, but I also still carry her corpse on my back. There's a lovely poem by Jack Gilbert called Machiko Dead, in which he's making a metaphor for what it feels like, that loss. And he describes it as, it's like a man carrying a box. And I hate to paraphrase a poem. I wish I had it right here to read. But he goes on to talk about how you carry the box and then your arms get tired. So you switch and you put the box on one shoulder and you carry it like that for a while. And then after that shoulder begins to get sore, you put it on the other shoulder and carry it like that for a while. And then when you can no longer do that, finally your arms are ready to hold it out in front of you again. And in that way, you never have to put it down.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Natasha. Let's do one more. We have a question from Erica.
Hi, Natasha.
Hey, my dear Erica. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay. I owe you an email. I'm so sorry. But I'll get it to you.
It's okay. So I have sort of a long question, and you sort of addressed it earlier. But, I'm always going to ask about the archive, because I feel like you and other Black women writers like Toni Morrison, Saidiya Hartman, Hortense Spiller, even though you guys are working in different genres, have thought about the precarity of writing about Black women. And so I wanted to ask about, and so when you were talking, I was thinking about Thrall and the various poems about your mother, and then the various poems about Black women that entered the, colonial eye in the paintings that you sort of write about. And so I wanted to ask about how in prose you were sort of theorizing about Black women and the precarity of the archive. You've said this a lot, about wanting to sort of create a monument to your mother. And so I'm wondering if, so Saidiya Hartman sort of theorizes, that when she's writing about Black women and Black women's lives, she's writing into the gaps of that memory. And in some cases you are the memory of that, of your mother. And so I'm wondering how you were thinking about especially when you're thinking about the history of the United States and the racism that happens here and the very specific thing it is to be a Black woman, in the States. I'm curious what you were.
Well, I think you're right that I think Memorial Drive is also one way of trying to create an archive. I mean, because when we think about the invisibility of some of the characters you're talking about, Black women throughout history, and we have to read through those absences to try to find them. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm involved in, reading into the spaces and the gaps that were not only my mother's silences, but the silences in the record. Mm. But I think I'm also trying to make visible the record, make it accessible. That's the other thing, having access to the archives. So by giving you, as a reader, the kinds of things that would be in an archive, in a courthouse or police files, is making the record accessible, and it's making her story more accessible. I'm lucky because my father gave me all the letters that my mother wrote to him over the years, and I make use of some of those in the book. But making use, I think, of her own voice, her own document, is a way to insert her voice into the larger ongoing story, as opposed to allowing her to be erased and silenced as she was 35 years ago. Now she still speaks. She speaks in the pages of this book that a lot more people will ever see. And that is putting her story, our story, Black women's stories, front and center.
Yeah, really good.
Thank you so much, Erica, and everyone that asked questions. Of course, we've run out of time because there's so much to say. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much, Natasha.
Thank you, Donna.
I just wanted to thank you both. I don't think I've come back up on the screen, but you know, I really appreciate what you both did here tonight. And this was an amazing program. And Natasha, it's an amazing work that you've put together in this. And so I hope everyone will take the time to go into the chat and click on the link for Seminary Co-op to buy the book if you haven't gotten it yet. And thank you both for doing this for us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My great honor. Thank you both. Stay well, everyone. And also get Monument.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.